To unpack what's at stake here, I'm joined live now by Brian Winter, Editor-in-Chief of America's Quarterly and Vice President of Policy at the Americas Society and Council of the Americas. Brian, thank you so much for being with us. I think that one of the things that is, or many things that were shocking over what happened over the weekend, but one of the things that is most surprising is I think a lot of people watching thought that the US had left this particular era of essentially targeting sovereign nations and capturing their leaders behind. You know, we saw it in 1954 in Guatemala. That leader accused by the US of spreading communism, he was captured and taken. And then we saw it with Salvador Allende, for example, in Chile in the 1970s. We saw it with Emmanuel Noriega, for example, in Panama in the late 80s as well. Just walk us through how what happened on Saturday differs from those three examples that I just gave.
Well, it's true. There was nothing exceptional about what President Trump did in Venezuela if you look at the long arc of American history. Some of the examples that you cited, but if you go back to the gunboat diplomacy of the 1900s and 1910s, Teddy Roosevelt carrying a big stick in the region, this is traditionally, these kinds of actions have been what the United States does in its own hemisphere. The exception really seems to have been the last 35 years or so since the end of the Cold War, when the threat from externally, which at the time was the Soviets, receded. And when, a period when the United States was also focused on the Mideast and to some extent Asia. But it does appear that at least for now, President Trump is dialing back the clock a bit to an approach that is dictated U.S. and, that has some national security doctrine reasons for it. Sometimes we treat these kinds of attitudes as just the belligerent whims of, a would-be empire. But it's also true that the idea that the Caribbean in particular is part of the, is essential to U.S. national security is part of what guided U.S. administrations during those years.
What are the consequences, just in terms of international order, if the U.S. chooses not to hold itself to the same standards that it applies to other nations? If it chooses to exempt itself from those same standards going forward? I mean, I was mentioning just a few minutes ago this idea of Russia now being emboldened when it comes to Ukraine, or China being much more emboldened when it comes to Taiwan. Just give us your take on that.
Well, this is the question that countries all over the world are asking themselves right now. Our longtime allies in places like Europe, also other powers, including Russia and China, and certainly countries elsewhere in Latin America who are asking themselves if the United States of the early 20th century is essentially back. And I think that's still an open question. I mean, I do see some important differences compared with, say, Teddy Roosevelt more than 100 years ago. One of them is that domestic popular opinion in the United States would not allow the United States to just suddenly start invading country after country, especially if it involved occupations, as the United States did during those years. The United States occupied Nicaragua for 20 years, occupied the Dominican Republic for an equivalent amount of time. Lyndon Johnson, president during the 1960s, sent 20,000 troops into the Dominican Republic in 1965. We're not exactly talking about ancient history here. Domestic popular opinion in the United States would not allow that today. And so I do think that there are some limitations on what President Trump can and cannot do. He seems to be aware of that, in part because, we know that he left the Chavista regime in place there in Caracas, precisely because the United States does not have the option of putting 20,000 troops on the ground. So, we're in a new era, but just how new remains to be seen.
And what are some of the lessons that we learned from those examples that I gave in terms of what happened in Chile in 1973 and Panama in 89? I mean, what were some of the blowback that followed the U.S. essentially capturing or imprisoning leaders of sovereign nations because their policies differed from what the U.S. interests were?
So look, I've been digging through some of this history over the last couple of weeks, and there are some interesting lessons. One of them is that these interventions can actually be fairly popular, at least in the short term, including in the countries where they take place. Nicolás Maduro was a dictator. He brutally repressed his own people. He led to one of the greatest economic disasters and outside of war in recent world history. It's also true that the consequences of that crisis were felt by countries all over Latin America because of the exodus of more than 8 million Venezuelans over the last 10 years. Most of them went to other South American countries who can see with their own eyes the consequences of those failures. And so, I think that while there are a lot of governments in Latin America are nervous about what's happening, domestic opinion in a lot of these countries, in places like Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and beyond, is actually quite supportive because they see the end of a tyrant who caused problems for their own countries. But look, it's also true that if you look at the historical record, these kinds of heavy-handed actions by the United States tend to generate a backlash. It can sometimes take decades. But if you look at the gunboat diplomacy of Teddy Roosevelt back in the 1910s, you can draw a straight line between some of the invasions of the United States during those years and the rise of Latin American nationalism that eventually gave us figures like Fidel Castro, who based much of their political identity on opposition to the quote unquote empire in the United States. That created problems for US governments as well as US companies all over the hemisphere for a large part of the 20th century. So it's still early days, but it's important to have some of these consequences in mind.
Totally. And if you are the Colombian leader, if you are Gustavo Petro, you're looking at this and you're thinking, what? I mean, one of the things that you touched on is that this idea that, yes, Maduro is a dictator, was a dictator. I'm not really sure whether to use past or present tense here, but when it comes to Gustavo Petro, for example, his situation is slightly different. Obviously, Donald Trump has made threats against him too, and because Colombia shares a border with Venezuela, there would be real sort of consequences for that country if there were to be a much bigger crisis, humanitarian crisis, security crisis within Venezuela. But the distinction is that Gustavo Petro was democratically elected back in 2022, excuse me, and that was an internationally observed vote. So if you are Gustavo Petro, you are thinking what right now?
If you're Gustavo Petro, you are not worried about being spirited out of your presidential palace in the middle of the night in the fashion that Nicolás Maduro was, because you are a democratically elected leader. There is also no open indictment against you in the United States. But what you are worried about is a unilateral strike by the U.S. military on your territory targeting drug cartels. That, I think, is very much on the table for Colombia as well as for Mexico. Which has also been explicitly threatened by President Trump in recent weeks, including in the aftermath of this operation in Caracas. And you have governments in both Bogota and Mexico City that are very concerned about this. Yes, they are, they know that the problems that these cartels have posed to domestic security in their own country, but they do not want their national sovereignty violated. And so I think this is very much kind of the next wave that we're likely to see in Latin America.